Brendan Fraser was never hot.
He was super ripped at one point, though.
Okay, that's different from hot.
I don't know. I think he had a kind of, kindly, homely face.
He was never Paul Gross.
Oh, yeah, but his is just, die-cast, die-cast nothingness hotness.
Okay.
Hello and welcome to God Keep Our Land. It's what?
Mike Harris.
What I've listened to. I'm your host, Erin, and I'm joined by...
Patrick Meehan.
And Matthew Naylor.
Pod Keep Our Land is a show about Canadian politics, parliaments, politicians, and policy. It's July 30th, 2018, and we are podcasting to you from East Vancouver, British Columbia. Got a great show for you tonight. We're going to start off talking about the cuts to Greyhound service in Western Canada. We'll follow that up with an overview of the most recent federal cabinet shuffle. Then we'll move to Ontario and talk about some of the recent moves by new Premier Doug Ford. And we'll...
If Rob Ford was making recent moves, we would also, if that belongs on maybe Canada Obscura, one of the horror podcasts.
But also, if I had $1 for every time I've said Rob Ford instead of Doug Ford in the last 2 weeks.
It just rolls off the tongue, you know? Anyway, and we're going to finish out the show with a discussion about proposed handgun ban in urban areas in Canada. So why don't we start with the Greyhound discussion. This was announced a few weeks ago that Greyhound Canada, the interurban bus service, is planning to cut almost half of all bus routes in Western Canada. And in British Columbia, that means...
Literally all.
Literally all?
Yes.
Okay.
Almost half of their bus routes.
They're cutting every single bus route that's west of Thunder Bay. There is one bus route that's going to remain, and that's the Vancouver-Seattle run, but that was never run by Greyhound Canada. That was always run by Greyhound US. So they're actually literally just pulling right out of Western Canada.
Right. So let's talk about that. Greyhound Canada says ridership is down 41% since 2010. It's just not financially sustainable to keep running these services. They can't make their money back. Do they have a point?
No, because they're just a bad company that markets poorly.
Well, and they've been readjusting their schedules in such a way to cater to moving freight rather than moving people, and so it's no surprise that their ridership has been dropping. But also, you have, movement trends can change, and if it's not profitable for them, it's not profitable for them, and they leave. But the question for me is more what government does instead.
The movement trends aren't necessarily changing. There are other bus companies that have been springing up to claw away at Greyhound's terrible customer service, and
not where.
Oh, Alberta has Red Arrow, and
Red Arrow has 6 or 7 routes, and Greyhound was running 17 or 18 in Alberta. Red Arrow runs only on the profitable routes in Alberta, and the vast majority of routes were still being solely served by Greyhound. You're right that there are some routes that are still profitable, and sure, Red Arrow is eating into them, but by and large, vast majority of these routes are probably just purely unprofitable.
Yeah, but they need to... So, one, Red Arrow should be probably forced to take on some unprofitable routes. And two, if you want to operate on the profitable routes, you should probably have to function in the way BC Ferries does, which is you get...
As a Crown Corporation, I agree.
You get 2 profitable routes.
It should be run by the government.
Well, no, it should be as a semi-private Crown Corporation. Based on the 2000 and I want to say 8 amendments. But that's a discussion that I was not prepared for. So
So you're saying that if they want to operate the profitable routes, they should have to operate the non-profitable routes, and they'll offset each other. So do you think that if Greyhound wants to cut their Western Canada routes, they should lose their Eastern Canada routes and their Central Canada?
No, they should just be nationalized by the government, and then all their buses should be taken and they should be put on the roads back again.
So it's always operated as a provincial thing, where the province says if you want to operate on these routes, you have to also operate on these routes. And so Greyhound said, well, we'll just operate on none of the routes, and see ya. And now we're going to be in a place where Greyhound won't operate in a whole bunch of places that are really dependent on it.
I mean, they could occasionally upgrade their buses so that taking one of the buses is more pleasurable than hitching a ride in a cattle car. But
I don't disagree, but if they're not I'm taking them at their face value that they're not a profitable company, whether it's due to mismanagement or what. But if you're running in the red, you're not going to buy a lot of new buses.
No,
And
that's what deficit financing is for. This is
the bigger problem to me is that, this is a government service that we've contracted out, which is fine, but it's no longer working, and so now it's time to bring it under the government umbrella, potentially. Just like the BC government did when Greyhound pulled it out of a number of northern routes last year, the BC government is now unveiling and launching BC Bus North, I think it's called, which is an awkward name to say out loud. But they're launching that.
Is it Bus North, as in one word?
No, I
with a
think
capital in the middle?
it's 2 words, but it is not.
Oh, that's so disappointing.
It could have
because,
been
like the BC government naming convention, like BC Act Now, and
Just combining all words together and
Just
adding
two-
BC to them?
Yes, BC, and then a 2-word portmanteau that still has a capitalization in the middle. It was like only BC that did it, and I find it very endearing.
So
Yeah.
fresh.
I really feel bad for Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba because, first of all, Saskatchewan and Manitoba will not...
I mean, you could just end the sentence there.
Yeah, well, fair. But I can't see Saskatchewan or Manitoba with their governments and their mentality replacing these routes with any government service or finding any alternative mechanisms. Saskatchewan, as we covered last year on the podcast, killed their intercity bus runs that they ran themselves for a cost savings of something like $14 million a year. So those are communities that are just going to be, not supported at all. And that's really sad.
Yeah, I just want to clarify something you said. So you said that these are government services? And
Which?
that are contracted to Greyhound?
Essentially. So what the government has been saying, like Matthew said, like what we were talking about on this national idea, is that the government acknowledges that there's a need to have routes between cities that people can get onto and go. And so the governments have all gotten out of that game over the years via, handing off rights to railroad companies originally to run as long as they ran passenger service in certain places. The BC government didn't find that worked very well, so they nationalized BC Rail under the Wacky Bennett government in the 1950s. And then as rail became out of fashion, when we switched to rubber on the road, we started getting these Greyhound companies. The Greyhound companies took over for these rail lines that were being mandated by the government. And so then the government says, okay, if you want to run the fairly profitable Vancouver to Edmonton run that stops in Kelowna, you also have to run the milk run that runs through all of the Okanagan, which is never going to be profitable, that goes through like a Soyuz and Peachland and all that.
Yeah. So I just want to clarify. I don't think it would be a contract because if it was, then Greyhound pulling out would be a breach of contract. So it's not contracted services, but it's like a license to operate.
Yeah. So their license is dependent on the transportation board. So there are provincial and national transportation boards. The provincial transportation board is the one that is primarily responsible for providing these common carrier licenses, which allow them to commercially transport goods and people.
It's also fairly clear that Greyhound had been advocating or had been lobbying with the federal government to get some cash handouts for the last year or two or more, demanding basically that the federal government, give them some money or they'll pull out. And eventually the federal government called their bluff, and it wasn't a bluff.
So it wasn't just a shakedown of a company trying to get some more cash out of the government.
Yeah. I mean, unless they think that making this announcement means somebody's going to come in at the 11th hour and give them cash. But I don't know that that's going to happen at this point.
Well, they have, I mean... You don't pull the plug in a way that actually pulls the plug if you are expecting a bailout later to mix medical and economic.
So now Claire Trevina, Minister of Transportation, has some really tough decisions to make, and the BC cabinet is going to have to really have a conversation because these areas must be served. And there's got to be a way. They got to find a way to do it, and it does cost money.
So, to be clear, it's not a government service, but it is an essential service that we, in our wisdom as a society, have assigned to a private company. And, the provincial government in some cases will fill in the gaps on essential services, for example, on the Highway of Tears routes, which we have mentioned. And sometimes they'll just allow under service, which is the case in some routes in England on the trains, where rail runs once a week. Say that 5 times fast. Rail runs once a week.
Yeah. So it's gonna be interesting to see this play out. I don't think it's gonna play out over 6 months. I think it's gonna play out over a year or two as governments figure out what to do.
It'll certainly have impacts on community in terms of isolation, goods movement, public safety. Certainly, if people don't have rides between communities, they're more likely to hitchhike and put themselves into potentially dangerous situations. So, but it could also be an opportunity for some improvement in service. So you mentioned that Greyhound doesn't necessarily have the nicest fleet. And if they're not able to make money with the big coaches, maybe they need to have smaller coaches and run more efficiently, and maybe they could bring in more real-time service and integrate more technology into whatever service goes in to replace those Greyhound lines.
I mean, the fact that there isn't Wi-Fi on Greyhound buses is...
Yeah, just for
I mean,
example.
there's Wi-Fi on every other bus.
You know, if only we had like a comprehensive rail network to cover off communities all throughout the interior and the north that was owned by the BC government.
Oh, well, it was stolen.
Patrick's referencing BC Rail.
No, I wasn't, because that would make my statement defamatory. So Patrick was not mentioning that, and I was not considering that.
There is a bunch of rail revival going on now as well, which is, always romantic, but may in some cases be valuable and might help our tourism industry. So there are there are opportunities where there is hardship, I think.
Also, it's very annoying because, assigning the bus to, the lowest, crappiest form of transportation is not necessarily it's just a failure of imagination in my mind, because I lived in Calgary, and I grew up in Calgary, and you had to take the bus to get out of Calgary if you didn't have a car, because there is no railroad to Calgary. Or at least, for people.
Yes.
For cows and other goods, there is.
Yeah.
But...
Double standard. Cows.
Exactly. I was so disappointed. You have to pass under the railroad downtown, and there was, this beautiful thing to, Calgary's history of rail. And I'm like, can we take the train? And my mother's like, no, there are no trains for people. But goods movement, though, is also going to be an issue, because how are people going to send parcels? Which is, a huge issue if you need to get something there faster than Canada Post is able to provide it. And, I have moved with Greyhound 4 times for less than $200, which is, one, incredible. But, that should be an option. Freedom of movement needs to be more than, here, have at you. Have the ravening dogs of the market slaver over your bones.
Indeed. I think it's time to move on now to the federal cabinet shuffle. So Prime Minister Justin Trudeau just shuffled his cabinet. Interesting timing. We've got an election coming up in about 14 months. So many people are saying that this shuffle is just close enough to the election to help him get elected, or re-elected rather, but not too close to raise any eyebrows. What do you think?
I can't remember who it was, but one of the journalists said that one of the insiders in the Liberal camp said that the idea here was to put their best communicators forward. The idea is right now a bunch of the hallmark pieces that Justin Trudeau has been pushing forward are in flames. Canada-U.S. relations is obviously gone haywire. The cap and trade...
Although that is a political winner for him at the moment.
It could be, but it also could be a political loser depending on how it plays out. It's like playing with fire. And then similarly, the carbon tax, the national carbon tax and climate plan has obviously suffered a major setback with the election of Doug Ford, which we're going to get to later. Similarly, I think his sort of position as a true environmentalist is really getting strained by the fact that I now own a pipeline. And so all of these things have been going poorly for him. Similarly, Southern Ontario is awash with people that are very angry about the illegal border crossings, which we're going to get to in a second, which aren't actually illegal, but anyways, we're going to get to that in a second. And that's another file where this has been, not necessarily poorly handled or well handled, but looks bad for the federal government. And so the idea is that they want to put their best communicators out there to sort of try to say, hey, we're doing a good job, vote, continue to support us.
I find it most interesting that Dominic LeBlanc, the former Minister for Fisheries, has been installed as the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs and Northern Affairs and Internal Trade and President of the Queen's Privy Council for Canada, which, in times of federal strife, is a place that you put a pit bull in order to bring the premiers to bay. Stéphane Dion was someone who was appointed as President of the Queen's Privy Council for Canada and Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs back in 1997, right after the Quebec referendum, and proceeded to intellectually demolish separatism in a series of open letters, and it turns out that that's been fine ever since.
Dominic LeBlanc has not been a very effective cabinet minister. Dominic LeBlanc has been
Well, that is because he has had to conciliate.
studiously
This is not...
poor in his cabinet roles up until now. But he
He can
is
be studiously poor at stuff.
he's
but...
a real like backslapping old school politician, and so I could see him possibly being able to get along with a Doug Ford type. They're relatively similar temperaments in some minor respects, and so maybe that'll help. But I also think that there's some danger here for somebody that's been a chronic underperformer as a cabinet minister.
He is not a technocrat, that is for sure the case, but this is like an interpersonal portfolio, and it is going to be easier for the contest of wills to be won by the federal government with someone like Dominic LeBlanc or someone as stubborn as Stéphane Dion in that portfolio than it would be if the Prime Minister was trying to do that off the side of his desk, which is what the case was before.
So when you say that Canada's in a situation of constitutional strife, I think was your words, you're talking about
Federal strife.
Federal strife, sorry. The conflict between BC and Alberta and the federal government over the pipeline, as well as the conflict between Ontario,
Saskatchewan, and the federal government over...
PEI's in on that one too.
Over climate change,
Over
or
climate
the
change.
climate action legislation.
And the conflict between Quebec and the federal government, which has been running basically uninterrupted since 1867.
Well, and there's a couple of provincial
Sure.
elections. There's a couple of provincial elections coming up between now and the federal election, which could install people that are not very positive towards the federal government. The CAQ in Quebec are poised to potentially win an election, and they haven't necessarily put out a real platform piece on climate change, but they're certainly not in favor of necessarily a robust carbon tax. And Jason Kenney in Alberta, who is poised to become the next premier, has promised this summer to this coming summer next year to be the summer where they roll back the carbon tax. And so this is a looming threat of a majority of premiers really disagreeing with the federal government.
Yes, and to fight that, you need someone as both bullish but also backslappy as Dominic LeBlanc, and I think he is probably the right guy for that particular job.
And there's another bullish and scrappy cabinet minister that just got given a new role too. Bill Blair was given the role on the hotspot on immigration issues as pertains to they're torn between whether to call it irregular or illegal border crossings. But the people are crossing the border from the United States. Bill Blair is going to be hitting that one up. Former Toronto Police Department chief, and who has been shepherding the marijuana file through. So they're definitely putting a lot of scrappy people forward.
And more people than there were before. There were 30 cabinet ministers before, and now there are 35. And so that's interesting as well, to see that the size of the government is growing.
There is also a Minister of Seniors. Philomena Tassi was appointed after a resolution at the recent Liberal Convention that called for a Minister of Seniors to be appointed. This is important because we spend quite a bit of money on seniors.
Do you think this minister is going to rein in that spending, or
No, because most of that spending goes through Canada Health transfers
Right.
to the provinces. But other senior issues, like the fact that they have a huge amount of wealth sunk into them, which is distorting our economy in negative ways, is possibly something she will consider. Also,
Well, I think that's
the general vagaries and cruelties of aging.
I think that's a communications thing, though. Is the Canadian Association of Retired People's CARP is going to be able to say, "Hey, we've been calling for a Minister of Seniors. We've now got one. We brought this to you," and they're going to tell all their members. They've got something like 200,000 members across the country that this is the federal government that's listening to them because CARP is being listened to.
Yeah, right.
And this is again a PR move for the next election.
So, in a kind of Dominic LeBlanc-ish mold, Pablo Rodriguez has been appointed the Minister of Canadian Heritage and Multiculturalism.
Well, that was mostly to take it away from Melanie Joly.
Yes, but also to elevate Rodriguez is Italian, isn't he? Or
He's a Montreal-based MP, if I recall correctly, because Heritage will always stay in Montreal for reasons.
But Copps was Heritage Minister.
This is the modern era. I'm not harkening back to 1994.
He's Argentine, but that doesn't mean he's not Italian.
Okay. The more important factor is that they needed to raise up somebody from Montreal.
And I would think that multiculturalism has become an increasingly important issue as we see more and more white supremacy and that kind of rhetoric coming through. We've also got Mary Ng, who has become a cabinet minister of small business and export promotion. Makes sense.
And the first Chinese-Canadian cabinet minister of the Trudeau ministry, which it surprised me, actually. I thought that there would have been one appointed, but...
And, again, this is...
There are actually surprisingly few Chinese-Canadian MPs in the Trudeau caucus.
And again, this is positioning your cabinet to be able to fight an election, right?
Right. And then finally, we have Jonathan Wilkinson, who has become a cabinet minister for Fisheries, Oceans, and Canadian Coast Guard.
Mm-hmm. So there is a coast on his riding. It is a small bit. It is also one of the only Metro Vancouver ridings that doesn't really have a history of fisheries, but...
well, I don't know about that. I mean, it definitely has Indigenous history of fisheries.
Yep.
And that's true.
And Jonathan
that's definitely
Wilkinson,
been a focus of the ministry in past.
And Jonathan Wilkinson has a strong environmental background. Jonathan Wilkinson is a fairly good communicator for a nerdy guy. And so Jonathan Wilkinson getting the portfolio really probably means that the Trudeau government is trying to shore up some of their bleeding losses over the Kinder Morgan pipeline debacle. This whole process has resulted in a huge polling hit for them in a lot of places in Vancouver, and Jonathan Wilkinson can come in and probably make some announcements about some riparian area repairs and things like that the administrative DFO is going to do to say that we do care about the environment in BC.
Yeah. And I'm also thinking about the Harper government's previous cuts to the Coast Guard in Vancouver, and so this is an ability for them to kind of juxtapose.
Yep. And they've reopened the Coast Guard facility here. Right. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I hadn't considered that. Although I will say it is funny to see it not be an Atlantic Canadian. The DFO is almost always headed by an Atlantic Canadian.
Right. Yeah. So that is different as well.
Wasn't the parliamentary secretary to the DFO at one point Deepak Oberoi, who represented an East Calgary riding?
Oh, probably.
So the ministry responsible for First Nations at the federal level has made some changes. Do you want to tell us about it?
Yes. The Northern Affairs part has been removed from the previously split ministry, which branched between Indigenous and Crown Relations and Service Delivery into two separate ministries. The Northern Affairs part has been removed from the Crown Indigenous Relations portfolio and moved to Dominic LeBlanc's new portfolio, who we have already mentioned.
So what do you guys think? Are you impressed with this new cabinet? Do you think it's going to make a difference? Is it all just election prep?
I think it's good communicators, and I think it's the right move for the Trudeau government at this time, and this is the brain trust there is fairly competent in what they do, and so I think that this is probably a fairly good move for them.
I am really glad that Baidresh Chagger, who was previously the Minister of State for Tourism and House Leader, is now just the House Leader, because she seems to have gotten some of the massive logjam of legislation to flow through the House. And hopefully, if she is devoting all her time to that, the Trudeau government will actually have some legislative accomplishments by the time the next election rolls around.
Because that's one of the biggest criticisms that people have levied against the federal government, that they haven't actually accomplished any of the things that they promised to do.
Mm-hmm. They're not great at legislating, unfortunately, which is really annoying, because there are a bunch of people in the Liberal Party who are like, but we did the model parliaments and know all the rules by heart. Why aren't you listening to us?
Turns out it's really hard.
It is really hard, but Baidresh Chagger appears to be less terrible at it than the ministers were previously.
I mean, we are seeing something similar in BC. The BC government has fallen a little bit behind on some appointments. They've been really scrambling this summer to really catch up on appointments, and I've seen a lot of those. And so new governments tend to have a hard time if they've been out of power for a long time, like the federal Liberals or the BC NDP did, at getting good at this. And I get the sense that the BC NDP next year's legislative session will probably be substantially more busy than the last year. But that's because I think they're a very directed government with a lot of people that really want to focus on being ready to go, and they have the sword of Damocles over their head of the Confidence and Supply Agreement. Whereas federally, the Fed Libs got in on a lot of hope and a lot of change, and sort of decided to do a bunch of policies and priorities without really focusing on any one of them. And I think that sort of like they got comfy is what I guess I'm saying.
What about Alberta? Do they have any representation in this new cabinet?
Yeah, Amarjeet Sohi, who was a cabinet minister in, since the beginning of the Trudeau ministry, an MP from Edmonton, has moved from the infrastructure portfolio to natural resources, taking over from oboist Jim Carr, who I mentioned because I think it's funny that a man who played the oboe for a living was put in charge of building all our pipelines, because long black tubes apparently is a transferable skill.
And he clearly wasn't running that ministry. That ministry clearly was taken over by Bill Morneau at a certain point due to a lack of confidence in Jim Carr. And so it's really not surprising that Jim Carr lost that portfolio.
And so Jim Carr, moved to international trade diversification. But Amarjeet Sohi remains Alberta's sole cabinet minister. Unfortunately, both Kent Hare and Darshan Kang, the Calgary MPs for the Liberal Party, first since 1968, were, perpetrators of some reprehensible actions in the past, and so have been sent either out of caucus or out of cabinet for their, foreseeable future. The other MP for Edmonton remains the parliamentary secretary responsible for LGBT issues, and is relatively well respected, but has not been elevated to cabinet for reasons that I'm sure are extant in Justin Trudeau's mind.
Okay, well, I'm sure this is just the beginning of all the pre-election moves that we're going to see out of Ottawa. Leading up to the October 2019 federal election. Speaking of elections, let's talk now about the new government in Ontario. Doug Ford was elected to lead Ontario. He has a majority government. He's leading the Progressive Conservatives after ousting the previous leader. And he had promised to shake things up and be a new kind of leader, and he certainly has been already. He's only been in power for a little while now. And it's starting to feel like every week we've got a new outrageous headline out of Queen's Park. So where to start?
I mean, he's canceled a couple of things.
So he called an emergency summer session to get right on it.
Yeah, that's interesting, because usually parliaments don't sit during the summer, right?
Yeah, and like the BC NDP called a quick summer session to pass a couple of really quick things that they needed to when they got in power, and that, fine, this happens, but it's relatively rare that you call an emergency summer session to just slash and burn things that existed prior to you taking over.
He canceled the cap and trade system and learning about sex and Toronto.
Well, the Toronto one's more recent than that, but should we go into the two from the summer?
Sure. Yeah. So let's start with cap and trade.
It is still summer, though, right?
Yes.
Tell me that global warming hasn't taken over so much that this is the new fall.
This is the new September.
No, we're all sweltering here in Vancouver, and
it's so
is so very humid, and it is definitely still summer. And yet, the politicians in the Ontario government are forced to sit so that things that had been implemented under Kathleen Wynne can be canceled. So the first one is cap and trade for as part of their climate action plan, which was required under the federal government's climate action requirements. So that was a whole regime that had been set up where different companies could buy and sell carbon credits, and that's now been canceled, which means that the government now has to reimburse a whole bunch of folks for credits that they've purchased.
They say it won't cost very much money.
Mm-hmm.
They are incorrect.
Almost assuredly. This was a combined market with Quebec and California, with other states looking to join as well. And this cap and trade market, there are people that have bought a whole ton of...
It was working. It was up and functioning.
And it's a solid mechanism. Like it's
not the
fine.
best mechanism. But
I mean, it's no different from a carbon tax, and neither
it
of them...
is different from a carbon tax. Economists say so. But
there's no significant difference in outcomes from what most of the climate change economists have looked at. There are ones that prefer one or the other for different reasons, but you can have the same outcome using similar mechanisms. They're both ways to apply a price on carbon, and
it's more deadweight with the cap cap and trade system.
Not necessarily. I mean, I think I would agree. I'm generally in favor of a carbon tax as well, but they're not particularly different between the two. One puts it more on the back of corporations, and one puts it more on the back of consumers and corporations, and merges the two. Anyway, so the cap and trade system has now been eliminated, which is going to cost, like you said, Erin, a lot of money potentially as these companies come to Ontario and demand their money back.
And this isn't a surprise. This was something that the Progressive Conservatives ran on. It was one of the main issues in the PC leadership race. I think almost all the leaders thought that cap and trade was a bad idea and just taxing regular people and blah, blah, blah. So we shouldn't be surprised. But it does have implications because all of the provinces are required to bring in some kind of price on carbon in order to meet Justin Trudeau's climate action plan. And so if they don't put a price on carbon, the federal government is going to come along and put a price on carbon.
And in fact, the Saskatchewan government has a lawsuit against the federal government saying that they don't have the authority to make this demand. And Doug Ford also announced that they're joining that lawsuit as well. And so now Ontario is going to become a co-applicant in that lawsuit, which lends some weight to it. Now, every legal analysis I've seen says that they have literally no hope in hell of winning this case.
Nope.
But it can drag out for quite a while, and we'll see what happens.
And it's going to cost the people of Ontario around $30 million by one estimate of legal costs in order to try and fight this thing, which they are almost certain to lose.
But this really does make things difficult for Trudeau on a political level. Like, how can he continue going through with this mandate of a carbon tax and say that it's a provincial requirement if all the provinces don't do it, if a majority of provinces don't do it, and he has to levy the carbon tax himself?
Because Catherine McKenna will literally set herself on fire if they back down from this policy.
I hope that's not true.
I hope it is, because Trudeau
That she'd literally light herself on fire?
No, it's
I
because...
really hope it's not true. I don't want people to die.
No, no one will die. Trudeau is rightly afraid of Catherine McKenna. She is also one of those bulldogs in cabinet that I think will not allow this ministry to back down from its signature accomplishment.
Yeah, well, and it's going to be the interesting difficulty for Trudeau over the next year, right? Especially as, more premiers get added that potentially are opposing the carbon tax.
Yeah, it seems like Doug Ford's canceling the cap and trade system has sort of given license to some of the other provinces to make more and more noise about resisting this climate action proposal coming from the federal government.
Well, every good thing that the federal government does in all of history seems to have been met with massive opposition from the provinces. So I am looking forward to this fight, and given that I favor a carbon tax and that the federal imposition of a price on carbon will take the form of a carbon tax, maybe this will in fact result in some better policies. So an oblique thank you to Doug Ford there.
Just another thing for Dominic LeBlanc to take on, right?
Exactly.
Yep.
Okay, let's move on to the next one. The new sex ed curriculum.
Oh my God.
So this was something that the Kathleen Wynne Liberal government had been working on for quite some time to modernize the sex ed curriculum, and I think they were planning to bring in topics like consent and gay and transgender issues and modernize
talking about the internet and the dangers of of Snapchat and sexting and all the things that can result in suicides.
Right. And that brought up a lot of resistance from not just from the Christian right, but other sort of more traditional family values groups that lobbied the progressive conservative government. And so instead of this new curriculum, the Doug Ford's government has decided to bring back a 20-year-old curriculum. So what do you guys think about that?
Well, I experienced a sex ed curriculum that did not mention gay people at all, which was not especially helpful for me growing up as a young gay child in Alberta, and would have been really both affirming, and also it's important to teach young gay kids about safety and sexuality specific concerns.
Yeah, and we have the father of Rehtea Parsons, the young girl who committed suicide, unfortunately, because of the just the pernicious nature of the internet and young people, and that was a component of the sex ed curriculum that was going to help to prevent for future Rehtea Parsons. And her dad is now relocated to Ontario. He lives in Ontario, and he's hopping, screaming mad about this, rightly so, because he doesn't want to see this happen to anybody else either.
Yeah, right.
It's really terrible.
Yeah. What's interesting about this case is it really seems to have mobilized the group of people, the majority. It seems like a majority of people who are in favor of modernizing sex ed in Canada, and who may have been more quiet about it.
We're not demodernizing.
Yeah,
It's not
demodernizing.
Yeah.
But prior to this, it had been like a very vocal minority who were opposing it, and I think now that it's being changed, you're seeing people come out and really advocate for this topic.
Yeah, I think we all assumed that the future would march forward and that progress would happen and that these angry voices would just get drowned out over time, and so we all got lazy, and that's pretty common in a movement when you expect to win.
Also, just a reminder, when the government does something that you really, really like, drop your MLA or MP a letter.
Yeah.
They really appreciate it. It's very affirming. I've worked in those offices, and the general torrent of crap that comes at the email inbox is occasionally brightened by a letter saying, "Thank you so much for the financial responsibility, blah blah blah, whatever." Or you've created a program that really helped my life. So do that. It's nice.
Don't be the silent majority.
Be a slightly squeaky majority.
Okay, so speaking of cuts, City of Toronto's council.
What a tool! I'm just gonna say, what a tool Doug Ford is for...
So for context.
Doug Ford, former Toronto City Councillor.
One term. Only one term.
Yeah, but, was also an apparatchik in the Ford family machine.
Oh, absolutely.
Because Doug Ford was very involved in his brother Rod Ford, long-serving Toronto's city councillor and mayor of, Hazard.
So I guess for context, in the middle of the night, a couple of days ago, the day before the close of nominations for municipal elections across the Ontario province, it was quietly announced or leaked that Doug Ford the next day was intending to cut the number of city councillors in Toronto from 47, I believe, to 25, and transition the ward boundaries to be in line with the provincial and federal electoral boundaries, as well as eliminating the election of I guess regional chairs
and the regional councils in general.
Yeah, and the regional councils in general being the regional councils, I believe, are still being held together.
It's just paused.
Yeah, it's just paused. And so it's still just not for this time, potentially. And so basically he's just crippled local government in
cancelling Toronto.
The GTA. And it's very clear that based on the reductions that this is going to result in the left losing a number of seats on council in Toronto. So he's basically, as the premier, meddling significantly in the Toronto political elections, which is very odd.
But it's not really meddling in the election, but it is changing the rules of the election mid-game, which a lot of people in Canada would probably call unfair.
And when we say the 11th hour, I think it was 11 p.m. in Ontario when it broke. The day before it was due, your nomination paperwork was all due.
Sure.
The dude does not like a bunch of the people he used to work with. They didn't get along.
Most notably, Patrick Brown. This is it seems increasingly clear that a huge portion of this move is designed to stop his former political rival and former leader of the Progressive Conservatives of Ontario from running for election in the Peel region. And he has succeeded. Patrick Brown will not run for election in the Peel region. He will, in fact, run for mayor of Brampton, which will allow him to continue to fight the war that he'll have with Doug Ford, I guess, if he wins.
It's Brampton, York, Peel, right?
Yeah. So instead of being the Peel region chair, he can't run for that now because they've eliminated that position because Doug Ford didn't want him to run for it. And he's going to run for Brampton mayor instead.
What a tool.
This is mind-boggling that he is basically changing the rules because of one specific person he doesn't like, and then throwing in some other changes to do a couple more backstabbings against former political rivals.
I think there are plenty of people that he's using this as a political vendetta against. But I do not see a public policy reason for this at all.
Well, yeah, and they didn't run on this either. This wasn't mentioned at all during the recent provincial election, and that's what a lot of people are reacting listening to.
Also, the Progressive Conservative platform was really comprehensive.
Yeah, right. But the new government in Ontario is saying that this is in line with their policies of keeping government small and efficient and low budget and saving taxpayers money. So do you think this is actually going to save anybody any money?
No, it will cost millions of dollars.
Well, and it's just gonna inflame a war between the region and the province, unless the gerrymander, not necessarily gerrymander, but the attempt to redraw the lines does result in what it very potentially could, which is a very Doug Ford friendly council.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that could be part of it, because I think they are changing the ward boundaries to line up with the provincial and federal riding boundaries.
Yeah. Which is going to result in a lot of incumbents up against a lot of incumbents for re-election, and it'll be a lot of situations where, demographically speaking, the more leftward tilted incumbent will have a disadvantage to the rightward tilted incumbent.
Unless a bunch of people are very annoyed at this change, as they rightly should be, and it drives them into the arms of a slightly left of center candidate.
We all agree here at this table that, like, you know, local government is important and representation matters for political purposes. But the average voter tends to think less politicians are good.
The average voter doesn't... Well,
and so
no,
Doug
that's
Ford,
not necessarily true. The average voter likes their representation, and having their representation removed is bad for them.
And so Doug Ford, I think, has a sense of voters in the GTA to a degree. And Doug Ford has repeatedly, in question period, offered, when Toronto area MPPs, or members of the Provincial Parliament of Ontario, challenge him on this. He has repeatedly offered to go hand in hand with them, walking through their riding and door knock on the issue and talk to the people. And he might be right. People have an irrational dislike of politicians. And if a guy says he's getting rid of a bunch of politicians, a lot of people say yes.
Yeah, but none of those people vote in municipal elections.
No, that's the problem. They all do, because they're all old white guys.
I really wonder
they don't.
about...
Most people don't vote in municipal elections. It's
but old white guys tend to be your stalwart voter.
I am still very confident in saying that most old white guys don't vote in municipal elections, because most people don't vote in municipal elections.
You're oversimplifying the position that I'm
right.
Thank you.
Why don't people like
Stupid
politicians?
argument.
It's possible that there are people who are pushing that idea that you shouldn't trust politicians because they benefit from that.
Yeah.
Yeah, people who like centralizing. This is the crazy thing. Like, one of the reasons that he has justified this with is it will put more power in the hands of their representatives, because too many politicians means somehow that the politicians have less power, and the only thing that this is going to do is put more power in the hands of city technocrats who,
that's a good point.
Possibly, or more power in the hands of a very few elite group of people who do get elected.
Yeah.
And it will be more difficult because it will be more competitive.
Yeah, and it means that, like, there is going to be less citizen engagement. It means that there is going to be a less effective city council. It means that they are not going to get nearly the use out of that super weird building that they built just for their city council. That space dish will go unfilled, and that is an architectural travesty.
So a lot of people are surprised that Doug Ford is able to do this, to change the number of city councilors, and the truth is that the provincial government has the power to create municipalities and change the way they operate at will. That's one of their powers. Municipalities are what we call creatures of the provincial government, and so they're able to do this, but they tend not to. Mm-hmm. There's a bit of an agreement, or like an unmentioned agreement that would be overstepping, and a lot of people are saying that this is overstepping. Do you think that Doug Ford can survive this?
Yes.
Yeah, because it's happening right now.
Well,
and,
also the areas of Toronto that his members are elected from are going to like this. And honestly, I think a good chunk of the electorate in the Toronto area will also like this, because people don't like the Toronto City Council. And you're right, Matthew, that like people like their councillor oftentimes, their representative, similar to that Congress idea. But at the end of the day, there is a strong push towards having less councillors and less politicians. There's a reason why, the BC referendum on electoral reform caps the number of MLAs at the current amount, because they don't want to be seen to be adding more politicians to the province, because that is a view of the people. And unfortunately, it's a view of a lot of the people that tend to vote, which is the older, more conservative, anti-government types are the backbone of the vote in municipal elections. And I think that that's municipal elections and provincial elections too. And I think this is going to be, if anything, this is going to help him.
Well, and if you disagree with this, and certainly I think that because municipal elections are a turnout game, there is a possibility that this could be the case, get off your ass and go door knocking, or run for office yourself, dear Torontonians. It is incumbent on the people who are living in the municipality to get up and do something about this. And if they do, then great. And if they let this sail on through, then that's on them.
It's also an interesting test, I think, of the backbench MPPs on the Conservative Party is what we've seen with the rise of Trump. And I think Doug Ford has some Trump-like qualities in terms of how he approaches government. Is that the Republican backbench has broadly just supported Trump's anti-democratic activities over and over again. And the question I had, and I talked about this with Stuart Prest, who's a UBC professor poli-sci, the night that it happened in Ontario, and he said that he thought that Doug Ford would walk it back the next day. And I said, I'm not sure. It depends on, among other things, whether or not the backbench MPP on the PC caucus in Ontario has got that sense of civil society and civil duty, or whether or not they care more about winning than anything else. And there's no uprising emerging out of that PC caucus right now. So to my mind, it looks like they're willing to go along with Doug Ford's antics as long as he wins elections.
This would be a really good place for a rival to Doug Ford to really plant their flag on a basically it's not non-controversial, but there's such a good case to be made for not doing it that they could easily create a little power base for themselves within the PC party if they ever had leadership ambitions themselves.
Well, and we're seeing so many parallels with the Trumpism, which is, people say, well, eventually the PC caucus will rebel against him. Eventually you'll see this sense of humanity prevailing within that party. And it, we're not seeing it yet. And I'm worried because we always thought that Trumpism couldn't come to Canada, and to a certain degree it has. It doesn't have that same nativist bent that Trump has brought in, nor the same sort of weird. It does to a degree, but Doug Ford is very much a man of the people when it comes to people of color and whatnot. That's where he gets a lot of support.
Although polling results in among communities of color in Canada indicate some weird resistance to immigration, which is strange.
Yeah, but yeah, so it's bizarre. And we'll see where it goes, because this is not good.
Nope, it's bad, in fact.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is probably the best time that he could have done it. If you're going to do something this controversial and unprecedented and unpopular, do it right at the beginning of your mandate. He's got 4 or 5 years to for people to forget, and we'll see if they do.
Normally do the painful but good stuff, like put all the Brussels sprouts right at the beginning of the meal. I don't understand that. I love Brussels sprouts, but put all the Brussels sprouts right at the beginning of the meal, and then wait for people to get all their weed at the end.
Well, I guess if you are a PC, you believe that this is good for them,
and it probably is. It probably is good for them politically, because it could result in a Toronto City Council that supports the PC party.
Yes, but
which I don't think you were going to see otherwise.
Yes, but then do it at the end where it's
but
energizes your base.
But this is the municipal elections.
Don't they aren't they every... Yeah, I guess so.
They don't come around every year.
I mean, they could just amend them and fire half of them and fire the entire council and redo the entire thing. Because, again, municipalities are creatures of the province, which, tune into the Camby Report for discussions on Surrey, but provinces have different powers from municipalities and significantly less power than comparable entities in the United States.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, speaking of Toronto, some other really shaking news. Recent shooting on the Danforth neighborhood in Toronto. Really, really tragic. 2 young girls were killed. Many people were injured. And a lot of people are now calling in Toronto for a ban on handguns. So I thought maybe we could have a bit of discussion about what it means to own a gun in Canada, and what does the gun pro-gun, anti-gun debate look like here in Canada? We hear a lot about gun issues in the United States, and it's a very different situation here in Canada, but there is a debate going on, and events like this bring that to the fore. So, the mayor of Toronto, John Tory, has called for a ban on handguns in urban areas. The Toronto City Council has passed a motion to lobby for this. What do you guys think?
Not much.
I found it absolutely mind-boggling. And, there's a conversation to be had about firearms and gun control and ways that we can make improvements to our system, which is already a lot more robust and fair than the United States one when it comes to keeping guns out of the wrong people's hands on a legal level. But I found it mind-boggling was a city councillor in Toronto opposed the handgun ban, but counter-proposed a curfew on minors in the city, a mandatory curfew on minors in the city.
Seriously?
Yeah, and so
jokingly.
so we have a right to firearms, but keep the kids off the street just in case people with firearms are out and about.
Well, that's not justifiable in a free and democratic society.
Well, and that's the same Americanism that you see, where they'd rather legally make it so that all backpacks going into a school are transparent rather than change the gun laws. They would rather all these things, and so it's this continuation of this stupid debate that we have. And I get so frustrated by the gun control debate because those that oppose gun control are unwilling to talk about rational gun control changes, and those that support gun control are unwilling to talk about rational gun control changes.
Well, to quote a president, that city councillor with that policy is demonstrating that he has perhaps a .22 caliber mind in a .357 Magnum world.
Jed Bartlett.
But number one, that is self-evidently unconstitutional, prima facie nonsense.
Oh yeah. And also just nonsense, like you say. Yeah.
Okay, it's also just victim blaming garbage. Oh, the fault of the way that we can prevent children from being shot is to severely restrict the time children spent outside. We already have the Xbox. They don't need more encouragement.
Yeah, good point. So one of the big things that's different in Canada, of course, we don't have Second Amendment rights to bear arms. That's not really an issue that we have to contend with. And we do have pretty comprehensive gun control. It's very difficult to obtain a license to possess a handgun. It's a little bit easier to have a long gun. And in order to travel with a handgun, it's even more difficult.
Yeah, you require what's called a TRA, which is filed with the police, with the local police force, which is basically you filing a request to be able to move your firearm from your home to either another place of storage or a gun range. So if you're moving apartments, you would need to file a TRA. If you're going to your gun range to fire your rifle that you're a member at, you would need to file a TRA. TRAs are not necessarily, I think, effective gun control. I'm not sure where the value is there, but we do have significant rules when it comes to that kind of thing.
Deterrent through bureaucracy?
Actually, yes, that is basically what it is. Because I was going to actually take issue with the word difficult, because it's not difficult. It is easy. It is, however, onerous.
Right.
TRA, by the way, stands for Threat and Risk Assessment.
You're not allowed to take the same route to the gun range that you take back, for example, among other things within your threat and risk assessment.
I'm using the other side of the road.
The thing is that...
You're not allowed to do that anyway.
Well, the thing is that the TRA is viewed as such a pro forma anyways, that argument might even fly.
But, it is still an onerous thing, because you have to go in into an interview, and you have to get references, and you have to have people saying, is this person, for example, depressed? Would that depression ever...
You don't have to do that for a TRA.
For the handgun license.
Oh, yeah, for your PAL. Yes. Yeah. So, see, once you've got your PAL, though, you can keep it going for years. You just renew it every year. And then the PAL gets checked. It's supposed to get checked every time you sell or purchase a firearm. It's spotty as to whether or not it gets logged. It oftentimes will just get looked at. But those are minor changes that would be beneficial, I think, is to log a sale every time. So you have to confirm that the person's PAL is still up and running and still
possession and
acceptable.
Acquisition license.
Yeah.
And to get that license, the RCMP is going to take references from your friends and family. They're going to notify all your former roommates and partners. They're going to let people know, and they're going to make sure that the people around you are safe. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they do.
For the PAL, like,
trying to remember.
like you have to at least submit context to them, saying like, these are my references, these are people that I know.
I don't think they call very many of those.
Well, like, that's basically the same system that we have for all other crimes and all other government actions. It's spot enforcement.
Yeah.
The fact that you are required to do it is basically a deterrent for people to not apply. The Ministry of Public Safety invites you to not apply for a handgun.
So there is a process. It's complex. It's expensive. It has all sorts of checks and balances. And what the Canadian gun lobby says is applying more rules is only going to further police people who are already obeying the rules. And it's the illegal guns that we have to worry about, the either guns coming in illegally from the United States or people within Canada illegally purchasing a gun from somebody else who's been through the screening process. And so that's their argument, that it's these illegal guns that are actually causing the problems. Is there anything that Canada can do to address that issue of illegal guns?
It's a good question. I was harken back to watching Lou Dobbs back in the early 2000s, and he was talking to a U.S. border control agent, and the border control agent was talking about how marijuana kept getting shipped down to the United States from British Columbia. And Lou Dobbs said, "Isn't there anything that Canadians can do to stop this flood of illegal marijuana into our country?" And the border control agent said, "Well, they oftentimes trade the marijuana for cocaine and guns." And Lou Dobbs sort of went, "Well, okay." And so I guess, better interdiction of drug trafficking between Canada and the United States, absolutely on that list. All of those things. But, we do have, ways to have better gun laws still in this country.
It's interesting, the statistics on the type of guns that are used in violent crime in Canada, because most guns that are used in violent crime in Canada are long guns, which...
If you subtract, and this is ugly, but if you subtract domestic violent crime...
Yes, which, by the way, a woman every other day is killed by a gun in Canada. But yes, if you exclude that, which I don't really see a case for, but
well, at that point, it's the firearms that are within a home. That's not
which, by the way, are mostly used for suicides. If they're going to be used against a person. So there's a good case to not have them in homes. But I think it should be relatively easy to own a gun, but very annoying. Like, very, very annoying, but simple. Sorry, not simple. Very, very annoying, but, like, onerous, and, like, only if you really, really want it and submit yourself to, like, the privilege checks of the state. And I mean, like, owning a gun is a privilege granted to you by the crown, and not an inalienable right.
Which is basically how it is now. It is a very onerous and difficult process. Like you said, Erin, it's not cheap. It's not expensive. It's like $150, $200. If you do it with a group of if you get a group of your friends together, you can get a deal and get done like $100. But like, and then it takes like 6 months to get your license before you can purchase anything. It's not like the U.S. gun shows where you just show up and buy a gun. And so it is an onerous process here. And like we can find ways to improve them, and I always recommend that. But I don't know necessarily that our firearm laws are going to be where we are going to solve a lot of our gun crime problems. I think our gun crime problems are oftentimes more mental health problems. They're oftentimes more problems with social determinants, right? We have fairly onerous gun laws.
And we have a lot of guns. Like, a lot of guns.
Yeah.
Right.
But, like, because it is so onerous to get them, as opposed to, like, the grab bag at the fair, which is somehow what it seems like in the United States, the amount of guns that are in the hands of people who shouldn't have them is much, much lower in Canada than in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it kind of seems like there's two kind of central issues. There's keeping guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them, and then there's also just making sure there are fewer guns floating around out there. Because often those crimes, like you say, or the suicides or whatnot, are committed by people who are not registered to that weapon. The gun just happened to be available to them. And probably it's going to take action on both those cases, and then add in the piece that you mentioned, Patrick, around mental health, domestic violence prevention. and just increase services and enforcement. Any final thoughts on gun control in urban areas?
If someone can come up with a way to like prevent illegal guns from entering Canada and then circulating within Canada, I am very interested in knowing what that is. But everything else seems like panic legislation at the moment.
I have okay, would you be willing to accept longer waits at the border?
Yep.
Well, the real question is, are they coming through the border line, the crossings, or are they coming through being, walked through or humped through in some other manner? Most of the drug trade is not necessarily coming through the borders, but also, like, it's hard to figure that stuff out. And then there's, the civil society elements to it. There is a place for further enforcement, and there are ways that we can find the ways that they're coming into the country.
Although, in general, yes, I would accept a longer wait at the border.
Or we could just spend more money and open more lanes.
Yeah.
Right. Sometimes when I cross from the U.S. into Canada, it seems like the border guards are more concerned about me bringing apples into Canada.
Hey,
firearms.
biosecurity is fucking important.
Oh, God. You don't start this rant.
Evil alien apples!
We're already an hour long. We don't have time for this.
Okay, that's probably enough politics for one day. What else have you guys been thinking about these days?
I could use some help. So, our apartment is very warm, and we want to get like a small AC unit for our bedroom. But we have a cat that needs to move in and out of the room every night, all the time. So, what I want to know is, how do I go about getting a new door for my door, because obviously I rent and I can't use the same door. This is my problem, and I'm trying to figure this out. And then cutting a hole that's like a cat-sized hole in the door so that I can then install that door. And if anybody of our listeners has any ideas for me on how I can install a cat door into a door, I would be all ears, because I am dying so I can close that door to keep out the light, as well as to allow for like a small AC unit to improve the apartment bedroom in this god-awful heat wave we've been under.
Do you think by the time you figure this out, we're still going to be in a heat wave?
August is still coming.
And September can be gross.
It's true.
And then there's next year.
Right. Well, maybe if you get the air conditioning, the cat will just want to stay in the bedroom the whole time.
No. He's not that nice. He knocked over 2 water bottles last night while we were sleeping.
He didn't knock them over. That implies it's an accident. He pushed them over.
He did.
What about you?
Well, this is your fault for letting a tiny tiger live in your house. I'm in a mood today.
Have you been thinking about anything non-political at all?
I mean, not really, but I am incensed by... I've basically been trying to cook new stuff. I made soup for the first time, not having ever really been able to, like, gather the confidence to make soup before.
Nice.
And I'd had this bean soup mix sitting in my cupboard for a year, which was labeled Canadian bean soup mix, and I checked the exact same words in Arabic. That's the bilingualism that is available to me at my local grocery. It's great, and so the Canadian bean soup mix was delicious, and I am excited on trying new culinary things as my job have to move a lot, and I'm just eating an obscene amount of food. It's unthinkable.
Soup is one of my favorite things to make, because you can make it out of anything that's in your fridge.
Like stones.
Yes.
Stone soup is a very important part of a community.
All the stones that you keep in your refrigerator.
It's a short story from like our youth. Did nobody else read or like hear the song Stone Soup?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Good
I
one.
really want some of those stone ice cubes that, like, they're stone cubes.
Yeah, they're porous. It's a bad look.
Are they?
Yeah.
Would obsidian work?
I don't know if it would hold its cold.
Yeah, it's a heat capacity issue, right?
Yeah.
We should test this and report back next episode.
And, Erin, what about you?
Oh, I have started, speaking of Toronto, again, I started watching Kim's Convenience. Have you guys seen this show?
Oh, yeah.
Is it good?
It is so funny.
Okay.
It is hilarious. And, like, CBC has always had this kind of, like, wholesome funniness, but they've stepped it up a lot. And
All
it's,
right.
like, it's pretty cheeky, and I really, really enjoy it. Yeah,
check it
definitely
out.
recommend. Okay, well, that's all we've got for you today. We are Pod Keep Our Land. I'm Erin Rennie.
I'm Matthew Naylor.
And I'm Patrick Meehan.
Thank you so much for joining us. Please share this episode with your friends, review us and rate us, and tune in next time on Podkeeper Land.
Good night.
Awesome.